Hello and welcome. Thank you for joining us for this online talk from the Freer and Sackler, Smithsonian's National Museum of Asian Art. My name is Grace Murray and I'm the head of public programs at the museum. Today, in this fourth installment in our Tea and Conversation series, we're excited to share with you some fascinating stories about several objects in our Chinese art collection. As we get started, feel free to take a moment to make yourself a cup of tea or get a drink or a snack to enjoy along with the talk. In the previous talks in this series, which you can watch on our YouTube channel, Freer Sackler on YouTube, we explored some of the unique spaces in the museum, including the Peacock Room, the Tibetan Shrine Room, and the exhibition Hokusai Mad About Painting on view in our Japanese art galleries. The program today is titled A Vision of Paradise, from a Buddhist cave temple to the museum. And we're going to take a virtual journey into this space you see here, Gallery 17 in the Freer Gallery of Art, which contains ancient Chinese Buddhist sculpture. This is really a special place in the museum. These artworks are incredibly powerful when you see them in person. And tonight, in particular, we're going to be discussing the two stone reliefs that you see installed in the wall in the back of the gallery space here, which have been here in the museum since 1922. And we're going to tell you a little more about the journey they took to come to the museum, which is really fascinating. To do that, we have two special guests joining us. Keith Wilson is curator of ancient Chinese art at the Freer and Sackler. A specialist in Chinese antiquities, he previously was curator at the Cleveland Museum of Art and chief curator of Asian art at the Los Angeles County Museum of Art. And he's curated and organized numerous exhibitions and published a number of articles. In particular, I want to mention his exhibition Echoes of the Past, the Buddhist Cave Temples of Xiangtangshan in 2011, and his very recent exhibition, Sacred Dedication, a Korean Buddhist masterpiece, which was on view at the museum in 2019 and 2020. Joanna Gohmann, our other guest, is a provenance researcher and object historian at the Freer and Sackler. For those who might not be familiar, provenance is the term for the ownership history of artworks, meaning who bought and sold what when, and Joanna is going to tell us more about that. She received her PhD in the history of art from the University of North Carolina and was a postdoctoral fellow at the Walters Art Museum. And Joanna is particularly interested in the history of collecting and artistic exchanges between China and Europe. So welcome, Keith and Joanna. Welcome.
Thank you, Grace.
Thanks very much, Grace. And welcome, everybody. As Grace said, I'd like to start in one of my favorite rooms in the Freer Gallery of Art, Gallery 17, which is one of the largest spaces in the building. Right now, it features about 36 important examples of Chinese Buddhist sculpture ranging in date from the 6th to the 8th century, a kind of golden age of Chinese religious art making. There are several examples of independent monuments called stelae. You can see a couple of them here in this image, the ones that have kind of a pointed top. Those objects were meant to be displayed in temple halls and courtyards. But most of the examples in the room are stone sculptures that were originally created not for freestanding wooden buildings in above ground temple complexes, but instead for man-made cave chapels, often sponsored by emperors and aristocrats who were believers and sought religious merit through their donations to these projects. As we will see, many such cave chapels and their sculptures were carved out of the living rock at specific cave locations across northern China. These subterranean chambers were hollowed out of mountains, huge undertaking. That is certainly true of the two large relief panels that Grace pointed out a minute ago that are the focus of our program today in the back wall. As we will learn, they were both created in the late 6th century, around the year 575 CE or AD, for specific locations and functions within a cave design. Let's start by looking at the two reliefs more closely. The next slide, please. Here we go. As you can see in this image, the two reliefs flank a standing bodhisattva or a compassionate Buddhist divinity. The material of the two reliefs is quite similar, a kind of dark gray limestone. They're of slightly different size and proportion, however. They look like they're built into the building, and Grace has already pointed out they actually are. Next slide, please. In fact, we have early photographs like this one, taken when the gallery opened in 1923, that show the reliefs in exactly the same location they occupy today. Joe will be talking about their initial and permanent installation in a minute. But before we progress, let's look a little bit closer at each of these two reliefs so we get familiar with their content. Next slide. The left-hand limestone relief shows a gathering of Buddhist deities surrounding a central seated Buddha. I'd like to point out the scalloped border along the lower edge of the relief, since this is an element we will return to later. Seems kind of incongruous. The next slide. Here's a detail looking a little bit closer. The Buddha sitting in the middle sits on a lotus seat beneath a jeweled canopy. He's flanked by figures who are actively engaging with one another in a very lively exchange. The composition and figural treatment gives the overall design a kind of strong narrative quality.
Pardon me, Keith.
Yeah.
I happen to notice some faint coloring on the limestone. Were these painted at one time? Or, and if they were, what pigments might have been used? I know the dealer
good question.
Had wrote about how they were covered in gold at one point, but it looks like more colors.
Right, good spotting, Joe. Buddhist cave sculpture, like sculpture that was made for freestanding wooden buildings, would have been painted originally. And then over the years, over the centuries, in fact, as the surfaces aged and suffered damage, they would have been refreshed, repainted. So what we're seeing here in this detail, you can see especially patches of red, I think, on the surface. If you look at them in the gallery setting, you can, in fact, see flashes of gold like Sitialu described. So we are seeing pigment applied on the surface of the limestone. Because they're mineral pigments, there's no way for us to scientifically assess exactly how old they are. So I doubt that we're looking at original 6th century pigment here, but it certainly isn't fresh 20th century pigment. We just don't know when what we're looking at was first applied. Let's look at the next slide. This is the other relief, of course. The second relief shows a similarly crowded scene with lots of figures surrounding a central seated Buddha again. It seems to be an outdoor scene, as you can see trees and buildings. In fact, tall towers frame the scene at the left and the right. Maybe the next slide, we can look at another detail. Here we are at the center of the relief. Zooming in, we can see the central Buddha, also seated on a lotus like the previous one. He faces a square pond at the bottom of the composition, sort of between the Buddha and us viewers. Looking carefully, you can see that this square pond at the bottom of the scene in front of the Buddha is filled with lotus blossoms. Look a little closer. You'll see that each of those lotus blossoms contain a human being, a soul that's being reborn in this beautiful heavenly paradise. This detail suggests that the subject of the relief is the heaven or pure land of the Buddha of the West, Amitabha. This is a place that Buddhist believers hope to end up in. The subject and the association with Amitabha and Pure Land Buddhism are important details that will help us understand the intended Buddhist function of these reliefs in their original location. When they were purchased by the gallery in 1921, the dealer disclosed that they had come from a Chinese Buddhist cave site. By 1925, it was clear that the source was an obscure cluster of 10 man-made cave chapels carved out of a hillside at a place called Xiangtangshan. Let's look at the next slide. Just to kind of locate us in space, Xiangtangshan is located in northern China. These days, it can be reached by an express train from Beijing in about 2 hours. But in the early 20th century, the place was much harder to reach. I selected this map to show the location of Beijing and Xiangtangshan because it also shows the location of additional Buddhist cave sites spread across northern China. Many of them are indicated here. Spreading from left to right or from west to east, the dot in the upper left marks the famous cave site of Dunhuang, for example. This map suggests that the Buddhist tradition of hollowing out sacred spaces in the natural landscape was introduced to China from South and Central Asia, traveling to China across the Silk Roads. Let's look at the next slide. Go right to the site itself. This stunning image of the southern Xiangtangshan cave site, where our two reliefs came from, was taken in 1922 by a Japanese academic survey team that first documented the site. This 1922 photograph was included in their publication called China Bukyo Shi Seki Hokyo, which offered the world its first glimpse of the site. You can see the series of caves, kind of difficult to see, but if you notice the large roof near the center of the image, just below that roof, you'll see some carved stone openings into the landscape. Those are the entrances to different cave chambers. Inscriptions associated with the site suggest that it was developed during the brief Northern Qi dynasty, which ruled the northeast quadrant of China from 550 to 577, a very, very brief period, which allows us to date the site and the sculptures from it fairly precisely. Next slide. In this more modern view, you can see the location a little bit easier, as well as the character and the entrances to the caves. I've annotated the image with the floor plans and locations of the 7 caves at this site. Next slide. We're specifically interested in caves 1 and 2 tonight, which are located on a lower tier, lower on the sloping site below the 5 caves above. So you can see I've circled them here on the photograph. Next slide. Both caves 1 and 2 are square rooms that were hollowed out of the mountain setting. And in this slide at the left, you can see a plan of the cave, as well as surrounding elevations that illustrate the design of the walls. The red arrow indicates how you would have entered the cave. Essentially, the same design was characteristic of both Cave 1 and Cave 2. They were both dominated by a central square mass shown in dark black in the middle of the cave plan, right in front of the red arrow. That central feature was actually the main altar of each of the caves and contained that cave's main religious images. The altar was the first thing that a visitor would have seen upon entering. As you can tell from the floor plan, the actual space inside these caves is very small, essentially a narrow walkway around the 4 sides of the central altar. The main purpose of caves like this was venerating the main image and circumambulating or walking around the deities in a ritual fashion to gain religious merit. On the right half of the slide, the photo next to the plan shows the view that a visitor would have encountered upon entering the cave. In the upper right, you can see a photograph of the upper portion of the central altar in Cave 1, where it meets the ceiling. This photo was taken not in 1922, but in 1935. You'll see immediately that this element in this altar contains a relief carving almost identical to one of our reliefs in the friar.
Keith,
Yeah.
I'm wondering, it would be rather dark in here, and if our reliefs were perched up as high as these, I'm wondering who would see them, how they would see them, and perhaps what function would these type of sculptures perform?
It's important to remember with an undertaking like this, which would have been incredibly costly, hollowing out these spaces from a mountainside. They were probably produced by aristocrats. We don't know how widely available they would have been to common believers at the time. So it's a little bit difficult to imagine how many visitors would have been able to actually experience the site. In terms of what they would have seen, if you look at the left-hand half of this slide in the elevation of the front wall, which is actually at the bottom below that red arrow, you can see the entrance and then some windows on that front wall. There would have been openings to the outside that would have allowed some natural light into the interior, but we assume that there must have been some kind of artificial lighting, where there would have been candles or torches on the interior. So any of that gold that you mentioned in terms of surface pigment would have picked up and reflected that light in a really dramatic and lively way. I think, my experience with these cave sites is the caves are both beautiful and scary, kind of claustrophobic, tight, a little bit damp. So I think the experience of a modern viewer would have been somewhat similar to a viewer in the 6th century. The images would have kind of appeared in a very animated fashion with the kind of light that would have been available. Does that help understand what it would have felt like?
Definitely. Thank you.
Let's go to the next slide, Andy. Great. So this insight into the location of the gathering of Buddhas and Bodhisattvas relief in the friar, like the one in Cave 1, ours probably was located at the top of the central altar pillar in Cave 2. So it would have appeared directly above the gathering of primary religious figures in that main altar niche. In the diagram that I'm showing you here at the left, the images are all gone, but that's where they would have stood with our relief over them. And in this location, it helps us understand that scalloped edge at the bottom that I called your attention to. This is part of a simulated valance for a representation of curtains that are being drawn back on the altar itself to reveal the images that would have stood there. That kind of simulation of cloth is here being translated into carved stone. Let's look at the next slide. The other friar relief, the image that shows the paradise of the Buddha Amitabha, was originally located on the interior wall on the front of the cave, so just inside and above the entrance door between the windows that I just mentioned. In this location, the beautiful image of a Buddhist paradise would have been the last thing that a visitor would encounter upon exiting the cave. This stunning image of beauty and hope would have been the primary takeaway from the experience of visiting the caves.
Keith, I'm wondering if you could say something about how these sculptures could have been removed from the cave without creating so much damage. I assume dynamite or TNT was not used here. Do we have any insight into the removal?
There are traces of chisel marks that survive at the caves, as well as on the backs of some of the sculptures, these two reliefs included among them. And you can also see that the images are fragmentary. So there was damage to the primary images as they were being removed, as well as damage to the site itself. Several of them had to be reassembled from fragments. So this was a very difficult and typically a very dangerous kind of undertaking, both to the art and to the artisans who were responsible for removing them. You can tell by looking at the diagram in this slide on the left that shows the location of our relief on that front wall of the cave, that the removal of that relief, or possibly an earthquake before the removal of the relief, resulted in damage. So now, in fact, the upper wall of the entrance, the front wall of the cave, is masonry. It's not the rock of the cave itself. It's a brick wall that has been a repair added to the front of the cave.
Wow.
Does that help?
Yes, definitely. Thank you.
Great. How about the next slide, Andy? And Joe, here I think I want to turn it over to you, and maybe you can tell us a little bit about what you've discovered and how these two incredible works of art traveled from Xiangtangshan to the Freer.
Of course. Well, after those artisans that we were just chatting about removed, ever so dangerously but carefully removed these massive sculptures, they made their way to Shanghai for export in the port. So we see that arrow illustrating their movement, which was quite a mighty undertaking. As Keith mentioned, there's a rapid transit train that can move individuals around now, but this was hours and hours and hours of journey. If you could move to the next slide, please. It's quite likely that the company Luwu Antiquities purchased these from whatever artisans had removed them from the cave. Luwu Antiquities Company was an export business that specialized in the export of Chinese antiquities, large scale, small scale, all sorts, to Paris, France. And this company was co-owned by two men, Wu Qizhou and C.T. Liu, who is the gentleman that appears in the photograph on your screen. And in the late teens, around 1915, 1916, this is when these objects would have been in Shanghai and for sale. And that's around the time when Luwu Antiquities Company would have purchased these. And around this same time, C.T. Liu was really establishing himself as one of the most important and prolific dealers of Chinese art in the West, Europe, and America. And he built his business upon the idea of encouraging scholarly study and careful connoisseurship of antiquities and presenting art objects that were cutting edge in the West and were not always typically experienced or readily available on the market. So with Wu Qizhou, he ran Luwu Antiquities Company and effectively and efficiently gathered Chinese antiquities like these relief carvings from Xiangtangshan, and then would send them to France. Next slide, please. So here we see the journey from Shanghai to Marseille, the port in France, southern France, and then the arrow there on your screen pointing towards Paris is indicative of a railroad. And this would have been how the objects ended up in Paris. And C.T. Liu owned a very successful, what became a very successful gallery. But in 1914, 15, 16, he was still developing. But his gallery was called La Yuan and Company. And he opened that in Paris in 1908. And then in 1914, he opened a branch in New York City. So all things that he exported through Luwu Antiquities Company went through Marseille to Paris, and then he could ship them out from there. If you could go to the next slide, please. So here I'm highlighting, this is the letterhead from Lai Yuan and Company, his gallery, and I'm highlighting the Parisian address. You'll also notice that there's a New York address. And these massive Xiangtangshan sculptures made their way via boat from Paris onto New York by 1916. So if you could press, there you go. And again, please, and we can track their journey across the ocean right to the port of New York. So if you go to the next slide, please. So what we're seeing here is Lai Yuan and Company's New York letterhead, and again, C.T. Liu. And as I mentioned earlier, we know that he acquired them in Shanghai between 1915 and 1916. And we know from archival source materials and people referencing seeing these massive sculptures in his gallery warehouse that they were in New York by 1920.
Hey, Joe, do you, for someone like C.T. Liu, who had a number of outlets, a number of shops, do you have a sense of which of his venues, Shanghai, Paris, New York, was his primary or most important location?
Well, of course, Shanghai was the most important for him, as that was his supply source. Even objects acquired in Beijing were then sent on to Shanghai for export from China. So in terms of importance for the functioning of his business and the remaining circulation of stock, Shanghai definitely. But in terms of his gallery, New York was really the primary spot. While Paris, he went on to build quite the exciting and extravagant gallery space. It was used more as a meeting place, a place to bring his special clients, and most of his sales, his biggest sales, were conducted there in the New York Gallery. And that reflects the post-war, the interwar period, and this transition to New York really emerging as the dominant art landscape, if you will. But so on that note, in New York, C.T. Liu and his gallery Lai Yuan sold several objects to our museum's founder, Charles Lang Freer. And he was very well informed about the progress on the Freer Gallery of Art in Washington, D.C. He was in regular, C.T. Liu was in regular contact even with our museum's first curator and director, Mr. J.E. Lodge. And until the museum officially opened in 1923, C.T. Liu sold to Mr. Lodge through Lai Yuan and Company to the Museum of Fine Arts in Boston. So he had two ways of really being informed about what was going on with the Freer Gallery of Art. If you go on to the next slide, please, we can see that early construction of the Freer in the 1920s. So he knew what was going on here at the nascent museum, not only through his personal connection with Charles Lang Freer, but also through his relationship with who became our museum's first curator and director. And he actually, Mr. Lodge, had a joint appointment for quite some time until 1923 with the MFA in Boston and the Freer. So Liu really had his finger on the pulse of things happening at the museum.
So he actually sold to both Charles Freer and to the museum.
Exactly.
After Freer had died.
Exactly. And so in 1920, when these objects are, these Xiangtangshan sculptures are on the market in America, Mr. Freer has passed away. And because C.T. Liu is so familiar with the tastes of Charles Lang Freer and so familiar with his collection, Charles Lang Freer's collection, he understood and had the foresight to suggest to the Freer Museum, the Freer Gallery of Art, that they might be interested in acquiring these incredibly important, large, and unique sculptures. So if you could go to the next slide, please. Mr. Liu, C.T. Liu, through his gallery La Yuan, reached out to Catherine N. Rhodes, who's pictured in the top of the screen there. And you see Mr. Lodge below her, Mr. Lodge, excuse me, below her. C.T. Liu wrote to Catherine N. Rhodes saying, I have these fabulous pieces. And she recently became a lifelong trustee of the museum. And Liu knew that her approval was required for the museum to move forward with any purchase. And so he sent her a what we would call a description and a price list to entice her to share this information with Mr. Lodge, the curator, and the rest of the individuals required to approve a purchase on behalf of the museum. So this was all occurring around November 22nd, 1920, when this proposal was sent to Miss Nash and Mr. Lodge. And if you could go to the next slide, please. I'm showing you here the group who Freer specified in his final will and testament and his agreement with the Smithsonian and the federal government. The approval for a museum purchase was had to be passed by these five individuals. So you have his friends and fellow collectors, Eugene and Agnes Meyer. You have Louisa and Havemeyer, Catherine, of course, Catherine Rhodes. And then you have the Fine Arts Commission of the Smithsonian, who was led by the secretary of the Smithsonian, who at that time was Charles Doolittle Walcott. So all five individuals had to approve any purchase to happen. And the exciting part about these two sculptures from Xiangtangshan is that these were the museum's very first purchase. And so it was a little rough going because they had to get a lot of ducks in a row and get Mr. Freer's finances together as he left a large sum of money for the purchase of artworks. But because this was the first time using it, there was a lot of confusion in how to proceed. So they reserved this sculpture, and by January 1921, all parties agreed to proceed. If you could move to the next slide, please. Now, as I mentioned, it took a while to get all the ducks in a row and to get the funds and transfer them into the proper bank accounts. So the gallery La Yuan and C.T. Liu were becoming incredibly frustrated with the museum. And to sweeten the deal, the parties required to approve a purchase suggested also purchasing a large-scale seated lion, which you see here on your screen, that I believe dates to the Song Dynasty. Now, if you go to the next slide, please, it was by March 1921 that everybody agreed we're going to move forward with the purchase. The funds will be available at the end of April. So they loaded, the La Yuan Gallery loaded the sculptures onto the train and sent them south to Washington, D.C. What seems like a simple train journey, though, takes a terrible turn. If you could move to the next slide. They broke. So what you see here is an image of a letter written by Catherine Rhodes to Mr. Lodge in Boston, alerting the curator director of the Freer Gallery of Art that that one of the stones has been broken. She says, quote, "The man who brought these two cases informed me that the third case containing the larger slab was damaged and the stone broken." I've pulled here 3 additional dramatic quotations about this terrible accident that seems to have occurred because there was no support under the center of this large stone when it was loaded onto the train. The quote reads, "The case has been placed in the car, raised at both extreme ends with no support between." And then the quote continues on saying how part of the crate ended up breaking. Now, these breaks were not all entirely new. The vibrations of the train likely expanded old cleavages and caused old breaks within the stone to reemerge and to worsen. But this was quite dramatic and quite upsetting for the Freer Gallery of Art and all parties involved, as this was the museum's first purchase. So if you could go to the next slide. The building, the Freer Gallery of Art superintendent, John Bundy, took charge of the situation. He was only months into his employment with the Smithsonian, so you can imagine his stress and his confusion as to how to proceed. But here I'm sharing his report that he issued to the Smithsonian Institution about the damage. And I'm also showing you a photograph of Mr. Bundy performing one of his many duties beyond overseeing the repair of the stones. He's feeding the peacocks that once lived in the central atrium of the Freer Gallery of Art, or the central courtyard, excuse me. Now, this repair caused a lot of stress also for the Lai Yuen Gallery, who purchased the wrong kind of insurance, the kind that only covers damage incurred in a fire and not in a train accident or a train mishap. So there was a big delay here in getting the insurance in line and the proper repairs made. If you could go to the next slide, please, you'll see the blueprint. This is the shape that the building was in around the time that these stones arrived, these sculptures, excuse me. And it was always intended that they would be installed in this particular gallery that I've circled in red. It's identified on the floor as, or on the floor plan as for sculpture. And so during this big delay in securing the purchase and securing the repair and securing the insurance, the superintendent, Mr. Brady, returned to the architect, Charles Platt, to ask for help in figuring out how to install these sculptures in a way that would keep them safe and sound, would support them from all angles and prevent any further breakage or any movement on that part. They didn't want these sculptures to move again. So as you see in this area that I've pulled out and highlighted with 2 red rectangles, they made the decision to embed them within the wall. And they built them into the wall in brick encasement, brick and marble and limestone structures, and they plastered around them. So these sculptures really are not going anywhere. And this idea to embed them and then finally install them was not executed until November 1922. So they arrived in March 1921, and it wasn't until March 1922 that Lai Yuen and Company, that C.T. Liu, that the Freer Gallery of Art, everybody had the insurance in line, the repairs in line, and a plan to really stabilize these sculptures. Now, Liu sent 2 different conservators to put these final touches on after the plasterers did their works on the wall. They came down, tidied up, did a final cleaning, oversaw the final the final repair of the cracks. And Catherine Nash then issued $15 for the two of these conservators to find overnight accommodations in DC and then make their way home back to New York City. And it was with that issuing of the $15 cash from Miss Nash that this case was closed. The first acquisition of the museum was made, and people at the Freer Gallery of Art could finally take a deep breath, Mr. Brady especially. So if you move on to slide 35, there they are in their final place here, permanently embedded in the wall. And on the next slide, if you could go forward, I show you some postcards from 1929 that were sold in the museum's gift shop. Now, I really want to emphasize that these works of art have quite a story that they embody. Not only do they express and embody the religiosity of their original location in Xiangtangshan, China, in those caves, but they also embody a significant moment for our museum's history. They embody those stories about C.T. Liu and Lai Yuan Gallery and how works of art came from China and found their way to Western museums. And for us at the Freer and Sackler, for Keith especially, these works play a central role in how the museum tells the story of Chinese Buddhist art and sculpture. So if you move to the next screen, I share with you the full journey of these objects. They took quite the journey. First in their original cave site to Shanghai, then to Marseille, then via a train to Paris, then to the Lai Yuan Gallery and Warehouse in Paris, and then on to New York, finally to DC, where the poor sculptures were, or one poor sculpture was badly damaged, and then finally into the museum walls. So it's quite the journey and quite the story. Now, I want to close by noting, though, that when Lai Yuan and Company sold these sculptures to the Freer and Sackler, C.T. Liu didn't share that they were from Xiangtangshan. He likely knew they were, though, as he was selling other sculptures from the same location to other museums. So it's quite curious that he told the Freer Gallery of Art and Catherine Nash and also Mr. Lodge that these came from a place called Datongfu Yungang, or near Yungang. Now, I believe Keith can tell us more about why he might have changed the provenance or told a different story in 1920 when trying to make this sale, rather than really sharing their true origin point. Is that right, Keith?
Great, yeah, thanks, Joe. And Andy, let's show the next slide. Because I think this part of the story basically comes down to one book. The publication Mission Archéologique by the French sinologist Edward Chavannes, which was published in Paris between 1909 and 1913, provided the first scholarly glimpse of interior Chinese sites for Western scholars and collectors alike. This was a lavish publication, huge folio-sized images like the one you're looking at here, which shows, for those of you who recognize immediately, a very early image, early 20th century image at the magnificent Buddhist cave temple site at Longmen. You can see the monumental images there at the center of the slide. The sites that were visited and mentioned by Chavannes in this publication, like Longmen and Yungang, became not just recognized place names in the West, but almost like artistic brands, sad to say. It both encouraged scholarship into these sites and thereby fostered a new area of Asian art history, studying religious sculpture. but it also offered a kind of shopping catalog for Western collectors. Since Siobhan didn't visit and photograph the Xiangtangshan cave site, it was an unknown place among Western scholars and collectors. And so C.T. Liu may have chosen to propose a Yungang origin for the sculptures because that was a recognized brand already, courtesy of the Siobhan publication.
Sure, and that sounds like a relatable marketing technique, something that we might be familiar with today, even. I wonder though too, what was going on in China at this time that nobody said anything or stopped anyone from taking these huge works of art out of these caves. It had to be noticed. And were the Chinese not interested in these sites at this time? Why were so many pieces of cave sculptures being exported and shipped around the entire world?
I think there are a number of factors. I mean, first of all, this was a period of, this was after the fall of the Qing dynasty. So there was not a strong central governing entity that had firm control over sites like Xiangtangshan or Lungmen or Yungang, so that the supervision of the sites was perhaps not as strong, certainly not as strong as it is today. Second, this was a period of rapid modernization in China when Chinese elite were looking to the West, to science, to industry, to modernize China. And many writers at the time looked upon the Buddhist institution as old-fashioned and superstitious. So that at the elite end of society, I think there was less interest in the Buddhist institution and Buddhist traditions. So I think we had a kind of climate that allowed for the kind of dislocation to occur that we've been describing tonight.
That's fascinating. And also it explains that the reasoning maybe behind the fact that these sculptures didn't cost C.T. Liu much to purchase in China. We don't know the exact amounts, but in other sites, we do have those dollar amounts that Liu paid and other dealers paid. And when they sold them then, they sold them for much more than what they paid for. The profit margin was huge when these objects entered the West.
But also compared to other media, for example, imperial porcelains, as a type of artwork, porcelains at the same time were capturing much higher prices. So this was an undervalued market.
That's true. And I know that the Rockefellers were purchasing an impressive yellow porcelain Chiang beaker for 3 times as much as what the Freer Gallery of Art paid for these 2 massive stone reliefs. So I can see what you're saying there. Yeah.
But it was a period that encouraged the promulgation of the first cultural patrimony rules in China, which began to come into force in the late 20s.
Oh, right. In 1926 is when the first law hits the books, if you will, but it wasn't very well enforced.
Correct.
Yeah.
But what we're talking about now, maybe we can go on to the next slide, Andy.
Sure.
Brings up our final topic, and that is, the issue of cultural patrimony and the protection of China's cultural heritage. I've noticed a lot of questions in the chat about this. I think it's important to place what happened in a larger continuum. So much of the activities that we've been talking about tonight, certainly we've documented the removal of these 2 reliefs can be dated to the teens. most of the objects beyond even the Xiangtangshan pieces we're focusing on tonight, we can document were removed, if not before, between 1900 and 1949, the formation of the People's Republic of China.
Mhm.
So we're talking about an early 20th century phenomenon here, and one that was international. It involved Chinese, Japanese, European, American agents and dealers, as well as collectors. The objects that were on the international art market, like the Xiangtangshan pieces, were purchased and cared for by institutions and collectors worldwide. This was a worldwide phenomenon. It really wasn't until 1970 and the actions of UNESCO, of the United Nations, and the promulgation of the Cultural Patrimony Convention that prohibited the acquisition or display of artworks that illegally were removed from their country of origin after 1970. So the UNESCO Convention and this date of 1970 kind of establishes a ceiling for the activities that we've been talking about.
But,
Now,
it goes without saying that's problematic in itself, but at least there is a date that we have to work from. But so, I mean, it's unfortunate and, that these sculptures are not in their point of origin, in their original caves. And I mean, what do we do? Clearly, we can't take them out of the wall to ship them back, and they can't fit back in the cave themselves with all the damage incurred from, you mentioned an earthquake, we discussed how they got out of there, and there was significant damage there as well with the chiseling.
Yeah, true. Someone in the chat mentioned a comparison to the Elgin marbles, and they're really quite different in one primary respect. What happened at Xiangtangshan and at many of the other Buddhist cave sites was international in character, so that the fragments and figures that left these sites were really dispersed worldwide. So it's not like the Elgin marbles where we know one building's contents were moved from a specific place to the British Museum. In the case of Xiangtangshan, the pieces that left the site are spread worldwide. So I think a kind of repatriation, which is often proposed as one response to this kind of activity in the early 20th century, wouldn't work in the case of Xiangtangshan and many of these other Buddhist sites, simply because of this dispersal to numerous collections worldwide that wouldn't allow for the return and the reconstruction of these sites.
Well, and also it was continuously changed, right? The pieces were over a larger time period, that pieces were removed from Xiangtangshan and other cave sites. This wasn't a one-time excavation of works of art.
No, and if you visit the site today, there are lots of displaced fragments that are still there at the site from locations unknown at the site. So repatriation is a very difficult topic. It sounds simple, but it's not. I'd like to end with a few comments on a different kind of response. I'd like to introduce the video and the approach that might make more sense. This approach takes into consideration that objects originating at places like Xiangtangshan are now scattered among dozens and maybe even scores of collections, and sometimes even within China itself. The objects will probably never be returned, and it would be difficult to restore them to original locations even if they were. The model I'd like to describe originates with the University of Chicago, among other places. I first became aware of their Chinese caves projects about 15 years ago. Kathy Chiang and her team at the university undertook a pilot program that was aimed at Xiangtangshan to digitally scan the displaced sculptures from the site that were in various collections worldwide. Eventually, the UC team also was able to establish a partnership with Chinese institutions that allowed the caves themselves to be digitally scanned. In an exhibition that we co-organized with the SMART at the University of Chicago, which also featured a publication and a video art piece, the one that we're looking at here, we offered a virtual digital reconstruction of the site. The video that we're looking at now, which was also featured life-size in the galleries, was created by the artist Jason Salaban. Jason brought together vintage photographs, current photographs, and 3D models to digitally reconstruct one of the Xiangtangshan caves. The yellow elements that you're looking at here in the video are actually 3D models that are represented in collections worldwide. He's put them back in place in the video. I think the echoes of the past model that involves digital 3D technology offers a promising solution to the issue of site reconstruction. In fact, I know a number of teams currently in China are actually involved in using exactly this approach to reconstruct specific caves at the much larger Buddhist cave chapel site at Lungmen, which I think will offer us a great insight into whether this approach to site reconstruction actually will work.
Thank you so much, Keith and Joanna, for those really enlightening presentations and that conversation. I think it is such an important time for us now to really dig into these histories and think about how some of these objects came to our museum. And it's so interesting to hear your research. There are a number of questions in the chat, and thank you for answering some of them already. You did already touch on this, but do you want to say anything else about if Lu Wu had to get permission from a government entity to remove the sculptures?
That's a great question. So they did not, Lu Wu Antiquities Company did not do the removal from the cave. Those would have likely been more unprofessionalized artisans, we could call them, doing the chiseling, but they would have purchased them in Shanghai from those individuals that did the removing. But to export out of Shanghai, out of China to Paris, Lu was an exception to the rule. He did not have to secure permission because he had such important governmental or political connections as a result of his background. He had worked for Zheng Jingjiang, who you might know as Zheng Renji, who became one of the active participants in the anarchist group with Sun Yat-sen. And so he could really skirt the rules and export without following the protocols that others did. So his company, Lu Wu, which he co-owned, really benefited from those political connections he had.
And has the museum or other institutions holding these type of materials ever received requests from the Chinese government to return them?
Not that I know of. Keith, can you say more on that, or?
No, there have been a couple of claims that have been made over the last couple of decades for objects that came up for public auction. Mm-hmm. But I don't know of any case where an object that had long been in an institutional collection had been the target of a claim.
And nor do I know of any sculptures that originated in the caves that we've discussed. Yeah.
Are these sites open to the public, or this particular cave site, is it open to the public now? And what kinds of activities are taking place there in terms of excavation or research?
It's really interesting. The Chinese Buddhist cave sites have, I would say, over the last decade and a half, at the more obscure level like Xiangtangshan, but at the higher level like Lungmen and Dunhuang, have become huge tourist attractions. For those who visited some of these sites in the 70s and 80s, when culture tourism was at a very small scale in China, if you go back and visit the sites today, you would be shocked at the number of hotels and resorts and golf courses that have developed around these cave sites. Not only does it show the development of a kind of culture tourism business, but it also illustrates a kind of secular regional pride. The sites are still active Buddhist sites. They still receive worshipers. When I've visited the sites, there are often objects, offerings that have been left by visitors, by believers. You'll often encounter people making pilgrimages to the sites. Many of them are very difficult to reach, like the shots I showed you of the southern Xiangtangshan site, not so much, but other ones are much more difficult to reach. So I think both on the secular level as tourist attractions and as pilgrimage destinations, they're experiencing kind of a new lease on life. And as a result, they're also being restored. So in the few years between my previous and most recent visit to the Xiangtangshan caves, there has been a lot of cleanup, a lot of repainting, a lot of restoration work just at the site itself.
Thanks. A question that just came in. Do you think that the Lu purchases helped give monetary support for the Republican cause?
I was typing my response. No. Lu did not send much money. The money that Lu circulated back into China went primarily to his family in Wuhan. He had worked with Jiang. He was a servant to him and worked in his antiquities shop. That's where Lu first became interested in the antiquities trade. And Jiang, he was also selling Chinese antiquities and other objects. And all of the profits from his shop, Tonying, were then sent to fund the Republican cause.
Interesting. We had a couple of questions about the original purposes of these caves, and were they used for aristocratic family prayer? Were they used as rest spaces for traveling monks?
I think the tradition of caves has its origin in natural caves that are kind of spiritual places in India, and often, with the monsoons, caves become a place where holy people, spiritual people who have renounced the material world take refuge during the rainy season. So I think this association of holiness and caves is something that is kind of primeval and probably has a very ancient origin. The practice of creating artificial caves is very much tied to aristocratic patronage. You can imagine the scale that's involved in hollowing out these subterranean rooms and then at the same time decorating them, finishing them with this elaborate devotional sculpture. It would have been an incredibly costly undertaking. Patronage was a method of seeking Buddhist merit. And so in addition to creating a place where you and your family and perhaps other members of your clan or your regional area could deepen their faith, the very act of donating to these kinds of undertakings would have improved people's religious merit. And the accumulation of merit is, of course, important in determining your status in the next world. And so, yeah, I think it's very closely tied to culture elites. And I noticed that someone asked about the concentration of these caves being created between the 6th and 8th century. It really is a kind of golden age of cave creation. And as a result, I think it gives us insight into a kind of fashion of the time. The late six dynasties through the Tang was a period when Buddhism was ascendant in China, and when most of the imperial families were Buddhist. And so I think it shows the social importance of Buddhism at the time, in addition to the political importance.
And to go back to what you mentioned at the beginning, can you say more about when the concept of a pure land or an afterlife developed in Buddhism? And one person asked, was it influenced by concepts of heaven or the afterlife in other religions? Was there something unique about the way Western paradise is depicted in these reliefs as opposed to other depictions of it?
Yeah, I should caution, when we refer to the Western paradise of Amitabha, Western there does not mean a reference to the Western world, like Europe and America in the 21st century usage of the term. Amitabha was the Buddha of the West in the directional system of different Buddhas. And so his association is with the Western quadrant of the universe. What is great, and I'm glad someone asked this question, another thing that's incredibly important about the freer relief showing Amitabha in the Western paradise is this is the earliest datable image that we have from China that is dedicated to the Western paradise, the earliest datable example. So it's another reason, not only is it an incredibly beautiful evocation of a paradise, but it's also the earliest datable example we have that shows the Buddhist notion of what paradise looks like.
Thank you so much to both of you for explicating so fully more of the journey the artworks took to come to the museum and their original context. This was really fascinating, and I hope everyone joining us tonight we'll see these works in a new way. We really look forward to the time when we can welcome you back to the museum to see these artworks and others in person. And if you would like to learn more about our upcoming events, you can always visit our website at asia.si.edu. And please do follow us on social media at Freer Sackler to find out more about our artworks and events. And again, everyone stay safe, and we can't wait to welcome you back to the museum soon.